Welcome to Why I Left, a podcast that explores the Great Resignation. I'm your host, Brian Akar. Join me as I chronicle real stories from real people about the reasons they decided to leave their jobs during the pandemic and what has happened since. Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of Why I Left. In today's episode, I chat with Sandra Hunter. Her 19 plus years in academia exposed her to consistent racial and gender bias. So she decided to make a career pivot and founded Wild Women Leaders of Color to address the workplace challenges faced by women of color. Her firsthand experiences, along with witnessing the struggles of colleagues and students, also inspired her to establish the Stealth Auntie Network, which is a platform that connects professional women as mentors with young women entering their careers. All right, welcome back. So our guest today is Sandra Hunter. Sandra pivoted away from 19 years of being a professor of creative writing and critical thinking to launch her business, Wild Women Leaders of Color, in 2021. After seeing too many professional women of color rise to a certain level in the workplace, but be continually faced with barriers causing untold stress and tension and really depleting their ability to work effectively, she created this program and this company to also just benefit all of those in the space. She also runs this Stealth Aunties Network, which I love the title, by the way, to provide an essential professional mentorship that helps young women learn how to navigate their work environments and access professional development and promotion opportunities. So Sandra, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Doing really well, Brian. It's great to be here.
Well, before we get into your work, and I'm glad we got connected online, but would love for you to share, your upbringing, kind of where you currently call home now.
So I'm currently living in Portland, Oregon, and that's quite a long way from where I started. My father was in the Air Force, so we moved around a lot. We didn't really stay in one place for more than a couple of years until we got to London, and I was about age 8 when we got to North London, which was probably the worst place I'd ever lived in. We're talking about a couple of decades after the war, so extremely, I wouldn't say impoverished, but a little tight with money, not welcoming about this new trickle in. It wasn't an influx at that time, but a new trickle in of immigrants. And basically fairly racist. I mean, I remember seeing the signs in windows, blacks need not apply, for boarding houses, for jobs. People would look at you askance when you went into grocery stores or into greengrocers or, because we had all the different shops. We didn't have big supermarkets at that time. And so I grew up with a very clear sense of being inferior. My poor father, who was Anglo-Indian, had that inculcated in him. And Anglo-Indians were a created race in India during the colonial empire of England or Britain. And so basically you had a lot of the army who were over from England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, who were, there to enforce British Empire standards over the Indians whose country they'd taken over. And because it was impossible to travel back at that time, you'd have to take a ship, too expensive for most of the army. So they were encouraged to marry locally. And one of the reasons they were encouraged to marry locally was because married men were more responsible, they were more settled down, they were less likely to have hijinks, as it were, and be a difficult group to control or contain. So the British Empire very quickly saw that this was a very positive thing for them because they were creating an Anglo-Indian race of people that they could then slot in to positions of communication. So the post office, the police, the telegraph, the railway systems, so that they would have a group of people who were entirely loyal to them and keeping a buffer between themselves and the Indians, who were understandably very upset about having their country taken over by the British. So this is where my family on my father's side came from, this Anglo-Indian hybrid. So He was very, and Anglo-Indians, the ones that I've met anyway, tend to very much favor the British, despise the Indians, because that was what they were learning from the British. The Indians were to be despised. So they placed themselves in a very invidious situation, because once India was liberated itself, people were given the choice. You have either an Indian passport or a British passport. You cannot have dual nationality, because it was very much Indians for India. So a lot of people actually stayed. The men found it easier to marry into Indian families and then kind of breed themselves out by taking the Indian name. And for women, it was much harder. They were considered very much, second-class citizens. And so my grandmother on my father's side decided to bring the family to England, because my aunt was going to have a difficult time getting married in India. So here they are, these Anglo-Indians, self-loathing Anglo-Indians in England, who also loathe them. So you've got this incredible group of immigrants who have no real sense of a culture. So I met a number of Indian people. I became friends with a few people. They were so centered. They knew who they were, because they had an Indian culture at home, even though it was not acceptable at school, and they had to kind of pass, as it were. They had to speak the language. They had to not wear Indian clothing. They had to try and eradicate their accents. They had to bring British food to school. They couldn't bring their curries and all the rest of it. They could do that at school. But at home, they had a Hindu culture, or they had a Buddhist culture that centered them. And they had, parents who were centered in their nationality and in their culture. We didn't have that. So it was very much about not being centered in anything, growing up.
Wow. And what have you been, passionate about professionally, right? So with that background, and obviously, like I mentioned, you've been an educator, you were an educator. So how did you get into that? And what drew you to the field?
When I was growing up, and because I was in a family, I was in an immigrant family, and for immigrants, it's keep a low profile, blend in. So the idea was not to do anything outside of the box. So I ended up teaching because I knew I could travel with teaching. I love teaching, but I didn't follow the real dream, which was to be a writer and a journalist at that time. So, and I was passionate about people who were discriminated against, because that's what I grew up with. And I lived in a liminal space. So the first question you asked me was, where do you call home? And I don't. I've grown up between places. I'm also between cultures. My mother is Sri Lankan, Portuguese, and Dutch. So it's about understanding all of that and embracing all of that, but understanding that no one place is home. So people, for me, friends and family, are very much home.
And, I got my start for the show really during the pandemic, because of the pandemic. And so I'd love to kind of take you back a little bit to that time. You talked a little bit about your professional journey, how you got into teaching, but talk a little bit about how the pandemic affected you and some of the work you were doing at the time.
So I was still a professor at that time, and we went completely online. That was, when we heard about it in March 2020, that was when everything went online. So I was teaching online, and that was my life. So I was very concerned about students who were beginning to feel isolated. So I didn't really think about my isolation, because it was really important for me to get students into groups, to know that they had a group support. Because once they got into groups, once you separate them into breakout rooms and you said, okay, exchange information, and now you're going to teach each other how to do this, then it became completely different. And it was really lovely to see those groups blossom. Some of them are still in touch with each other. Some of them have still got friendships with each other. And it was just, yes, at least in this small way, we're beginning to fight against the lockdown isolation that drove so many people crazy. For me, it also gave me the opportunity to concentrate on a book. So my mother died in 2019, Alzheimer's and dementia, and I didn't have a relationship with her. So the pandemic gave me the space to write that book. So I wrote a fictional memoir about her, which is now out on submission with my agent. And when I say out on submission, the agent sends the manuscript around to various publishers. So we're looking for publication right now. But I got the opportunity to go back into her mindset. So I had geographical points of departure. She never spoke about her life, or very, very small bits that you would pick up on. So I have very tiny little bits of her family, tiny little bits of when she moved to Mumbai to study at Secretarial College and then moved from Mumbai to England. She never saw her mother again after she left Sri Lanka. So it was actually going back into that and learning who she was and imagining what it must have been like for her. And then I saw who she might have been before she became this right-wing extremist Christian for the time that I knew her when she was alive, which created a big abyss between us. So I had the opportunity in lockdown to write a book. So I was very happy about that.
Wow. Well, one, my condolences on your loss first. And then, look, I guess going back and being able to write and tell this story, you have to keep us updated. We'll, would love to kind of share it whenever it comes out, whenever it gets published.
Thank you. I think this is something that, for your listeners, if they're thinking about writing a memoir or thinking about writing, you don't need to know actually what happened. Even what actually happened is flavored by how you perceived it. So we could actually say all memoir is fiction. Because let's say you and your brother or your cousins were at the same event when, say, your uncle had some incident, went off, had too much to drink and was saying this, that, and the other, all right? You will remember it one way. Your cousin will remember it another way. Your brother will remember it another way. Your mother will remember it another way. Everybody latches onto what they react to in themselves. So you're not actually hearing your uncle's story dispassionately. You're hearing it from a specific emotional vantage point. So that's your story of your uncle, but it's not necessarily the only story. So if you're thinking about writing memoir, just be free to write it.
Like that. And so looking back on that time, during the pandemic, what's one thing you would have done differently?
I would have left my marriage a lot earlier.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I left my marriage in 2021, 24 years, and I stepped away from it. And during the pandemic, I think I had the opportunity to come to that decision, but I stepped away from it at that time. But I think that's the one thing I would have changed.
Got it. And so, part of the show, obviously we talk about, why people ended up leaving. So you talked about being a professor for, like, you were almost in the game for almost 20 years. And so after being a professor for this amount of time, you decided to resign in May of 2021. So ultimately, why did you leave your job during the pandemic?
Okay, so there are a couple of reasons. I had decided I wanted to move to Portland with or without my ex-spouse. It turned out to be without him, even though we did have sort of a bit of overlap. But I had decided at that time I needed to do something about what I was witnessing. And I myself had encountered racism and gender bias, and I was watching it around what was largely a white academic environment. And I was seeing sisters of color who were just not getting, or, one or two people might get promotion. Most of them didn't. Most of them were passed over. Most of them didn't have a voice where it counted, which was, in department chairships or, places where they could lift their voices. And I remember seeing students, saying, I'm so glad you're here because, at least there's somebody of color. That I've got a professor who's of color. And I was watching my students. I think that the real tipping point for me was watching my students who were these incredibly bright, credentialed, innovative, creative, imaginative women who were so ready to go into the workplace and start their careers, and they would score the interview and they would get the job and they would face the same gender and race bias in the workplace, and watching them crumble under that and eventually become so much less, and some of them actually left. And it was just, no, this has to change. And there's a way to change it by bridging this very vulnerable gap between the educational institution and the start of the career with a safety net. And that's where the Stealth Auntie Network comes in, is just, we can do something with mentorship that will enable not only job retention for the company, which is massive, but also enable young women to understand that they can have a sharp and rapid career trajectory. It's not plod, plod, plod. People will recognize me for the work I'm doing. They won't. They won't. You may get an incremental bonus at the end of the year, but unless you have someone advocating for you, and that's where a sponsor comes in, you are not going to have that career trajectory that young white males tend to have, because the mentorship and sponsorship machinery is already in place for them, for many of them, when they leave their educational institution. I'm talking about the private schools now, the privileged. So, and sponsors and mentors are a little bit different. Let me just pop that in there. So mentors have to be outside of the organization. I just wrote an article about this. I'm seeing the rise of mentorship, because it's the click word right now, being offered in-house. There's a huge amount that's wrong with that, because if it's in-house, it's a paid program, and therefore the company wants to see the return on that, and therefore that has to do with the retention of employees. The young person's career trajectory may not be about staying in one company for 5 to 10 years. It might change. A company employed or a company sponsored mentor is not going to be addressing those issues. They're going to be addressing, well, how do you move to the next promotional level in this company? So you need, it's an oxymoron to have an in-company mentor. You need to have somebody outside who has a completely objective, dispassionate approach to the mentee's career. So that when the mentee says, oh, I'm going to apply for this job because it's a great promotion, the mentor can say, that's great. Let's take a step back. Does it fit in with your overall career goals? And if it doesn't, have those goals change. It doesn't matter if your career goals have changed, but let's see what that is, so that we're looking ahead a couple of years, and not just because there's this very delicious carrots, in front of you and that you could get a promotion. Sponsors have to be in the organization. They're in the behind doors meetings. They are talking about bonuses and raises and promotional opportunities, right? And promotional development opportunities. Let's say you and I go in to the same behind door end of year meeting, and on paper we look exactly the same. And my name comes up, Sandra's doing really well. She's got good client feedback and she seems to be doing okay. Let's give her bonus number 3, because we know that not all bonuses are created equal. Your name comes up and they say, oh yeah, Brian's done really well. Let's put him into bonus number 3. And your sponsor speaks up and says, something, I've been working with Brian. He is adding incredible value to this organization. I can see him going far in this organization. He needs to be really boosted for this, and you will go into bonus number 1 purely because you've got someone advocating for you.
No, sponsorship is huge. We talk about that a lot, almost not only on the show, but in my day-to-day life as well. And so I couldn't agree with you more on that. And you mentioned something not only about the Stealth Auntie network, but, I kind of led off with the Wild Women Leaders of Color, right? And so, after you left your job, you founded this company, Wild Women Leaders of Color. So tell us more about it, and, what types of challenges are you observing women of color facing as they advance their careers?
So Wild Women Leaders of Color was started to hold women of color, but all women are welcome in the programs. And my programs now have a really strong mix of women and color, and we get a white element we get some white women as well. Women systemically have been held down in their careers. So it's just, yes, let's do what we can to support all women. So what the structure was originally, and still is to welcome women in and give them a safe container where they can release somatic stress. They can release the bodily stress that they've accumulated from having to put on the suit of armor every day and be prepared for the microaggressions, the isolation, the marginalization, the being passed over for promotion, having their voices hushed up, being told that they are, too hysterical, that they're imagining this. So all of that comes at your woman of color and all women every day. So they need a space where they can de-stress before they can do anything else. They need to have the tension taken out of the shoulders, out of the jaw, out of the stomach, out of the back. So we start with somatic stress release, breathing and exercises to say, okay, these are the things that you take with you. That's your first line of defense when the stress shows up. so that you know when the stress shows up, you can take some space to do some box breathing, some 4x7x8 breathing, to, roll your head around your neck very slowly, to stretch the shoulders, to get out of the stress that's facing you, get out of the emotional reaction, which is, everybody has that, right? It impacts you. But you choose how to respond. If you respond in the moment, you're responding to the emotion that's happened to you from the triggering event. If you give yourself space, then you can become more creative about it. So that's the initial point. Then we center women in their story. If you don't know your story, if you don't know where you come from, if you don't know what you believe in, if you're taking all your messages from TikTok and other social media and from television and from advertising, which we get a lot of input from, you will not know who you are. For a long time, I thought I was Indian because that's what people told me. I'm not. I'm a huge mixture of everything. And until I did the digging and found that out, I didn't know that. If you know where you're from, you have a sense of being centered, of being rooted, and knowing that all that stuff, all those microaggressions, those eye rolling, the side eye, all of that stuff that comes with you is not your story, is someone else's story. The racism and gender bias that you face on a daily basis comes because somebody got out of the wrong side of bed, or they're being pressured by someone else, or they're feeling unhappy, and you are the nearest target. It has nothing to do with how great you are, how talented you are, how amazing you are at your job, how, there's all this stuff that you can do so creatively in you, that you need to know you have space to do, so that when you walk into a 90% white male room, you have your space. You've got your force field around you. We know that when we spread our arms, that's our height, right? The width of our arm length is our height. Some of us have, a positive ape index, and we have even more. You need to know you can take that with you. You need to know that before you enter your room, you put your shoulders back, you get your chin up, because you need to have your throat free in order to speak. Once you bow your shoulders and your head tucks down because there's all these white men looking at you, and you find the space near the wall and look for eye contact with the nearest or the only other person of color, semaphoring for help. If you close down, you've closed your identity down. The minute you tip your head down, you've closed the voice. You've closed the throat. That's your identity. So it was giving women that back and saying, you always had this. Recently, a participant in one of the programs said, I always had this. I have everything I need. I just didn't know. So it's getting them to that place, calling on the ancestors, understanding in your ancestors, you've got an inbuilt cheerleading team. You would not be here had it not been for them. All those voiceless, faceless, nameless women behind you and men behind you that had their names brutalized out of them, had their voices silenced, were shut down by a white narrative. They are still cheering you on, because look at what you're doing now. Brian, look at what you're doing in your work. This would not be possible had it not been for those forefathers, those foremothers behind you. And they're not gone. They're there. The minute you bring them in, you've got your own cheer squad. You can do anything because they're cheering you on. The other thing that's really important for the women in the programs is that they have the sisterhood. So they have their ancestral cheer squad, and they have a current day cheer squad saying, you've got this. You can do this. All it takes is one person saying to you, you can do this, and you get the courage, you get the momentum, you get the impetus to move into that next moment and take what you need and take what you want. And the whole culmination of that program is to lead women into being stealth aunties for the incoming generation. So once they graduate, they've got all the tools, they've got all the centering, they've got all those gifts they can pass on through a professionally guided mentorship program, so that the young women, eventually young men too, will be lifted up into their careers. And that's when they can make a difference.
No, I love that. When you think about some of those strategies to really, employ and empower women of color and men as well. I love the conversation you mentioned about, how you lift your chin up, exposing your neck, and those types of things. When you think about that, How has your own personal experience, like you mentioned, with bias, whether it's gender-based or racial-based, really influenced your leadership approach?
I think it's because looking at the world as it is now and looking at the younger generation struggling, because they are really struggling to make sense of what they're doing, they're job hopping and, what's that going to look like? It felt like something has to change. Something has to change. We think everything stops at the end of education. They've had their high school, they've got their undergraduate, some of them gone to graduate. We think that's it. That's not it. We, as the older generations, we still have to hold that generation up. And many of us do it in practical terms. We take our kids back in because they can't afford to live by themselves. That's one way of doing it. But the better way, the more powerful way is to say, your voice is going to define who you are, and I'm going to make it possible for you to lift that voice. You are going to make a difference because you've got everything you need. You just need the opportunity and someone to say to you, we've got you. You can do this.
Oh, absolutely. And so when you think about some of you mentioned some participants here, what's been, like maybe the most rewarding moment or a success story that you've witnessed since starting your company?
Where do I start? Over and over again, seeing the women understand the power of the sisterhood. It's just, oh, right, they've got me. Whatever I'm doing, they've got me. And then seeing women actually take some of the tools into the workplace and see that they can make a difference. I had one woman who was just being passed over for promotion in a really disrespectful way. The interviewer would say, oh, do you have would turn up for the interview late and say, oh, do you have an interview? I didn't think you had an interview. And then not know what questions to ask. So it was just getting worse and worse and worse. She finally spoke up for herself and said, I'm being ignored. I have a lot to offer. I would like to work with someone on this. She got a mentor who is actively seeking to improve her resume, to improve her leadership skills, to give her support with speaking engagements and speaking, getting her a little more exposure at conferences and seeking out opportunities for her just by speaking up. And it's just, she's blown away. She can't believe that this is happening. And that it's just, yes, but you need to keep your mentor accountable. Keep going. Don't just, think you've got to the first step and that's it. So it's just watching. She's just one example. And then seeing other women say, in the first 3 weeks, sometimes even less, it's just, I feel the difference in my body. I feel how I'm more centered. I'm beginning to address my saboteurs. I can actually speak back to the judge. Once you speak to the inner voice that criticizes you all the time, the minute you speak back to the judge, you've diminished their voice. I see you. That's not what I'm going to do. And just understanding that. And so seeing those pivotal points and watching women just celebrate themselves and go on to tangible results. So it's not just the feelies that we indulge in, but seeing actual changes in the way they believe in themselves, how other people react to them, and how they can actually gain more success in their professional environments.
I like that. And look, it's been a couple of years since you've been doing this now. And really what I'd love for you to talk about is some of the things that you've learned about yourself throughout this process now, because you had a vision for this, right? So, when I think about your continuum, right, you've experienced some things in your life from a bias standpoint. You saw some of your students kind of going through a lot of these things. You end up exiting, launch this company. Sounds like you're making a really strong impact. And so when you sit back and think about it, and I know it's only been a few years, but what have you learned about yourself throughout this process?
Oh gosh, how much? How clueless I was and still am, how important it is to have people on your team to do things you can't do. Marketing and PR, so rubbish at all of that. And so that's what I have now. I have a VA who handles all my Kajabi stuff and who does the sales and the funnel pages and the opt-in pages, all that stuff that I can't bear to deal with. She does that. I've learned that I need legal advice. So I've signed up with a group of people who help to Legal Shield, who help to do that, which is a great opportunity, by the way, for any of your entrepreneurs who are listening. It's very expensive to retain an attorney, but Legal Shield is a much cheaper option. You get to just sign up, and then you pay not very much a month, and you can ask for support when you need it, which is kind of very cool. So understanding that I need support, that you can't do it all yourself because there's so much that you miss. Understanding that burnout will come frequently unless you take steps to actually put in self-care. And self-care for me is going to the gym, bouldering, hiking, and seeing friends. And that has to be regular, and that I cannot allow anything else to interfere with. And writing as well. So you need to have these things that balance out your life. So it's all very well for me to sit there and say to my clients, oh, and you need to do the breathing, and you need to do this and that, if I'm not doing it.
Right. Right. So you're living it and teaching it. Living it and learning at the same time. So it's kind of cool to go into a group session and say, here's this idea by Bertrand Russell. Let's learn about it together because I don't know anything about it too. What do you think? And then all those perspectives that come in are just incredible. And it just opens me to more ideas about what I need to focus on and what I need to learn. I think learning is essential for me, and continuing to learn. Absolutely. And so this is one of my favorite parts of the show where I get to ask my guests some advice, right? And really advice for others. And it's one of the areas that truthfully I get a lot of feedback on. And so as I think about your story and then the folks who you help, what piece of advice would you give to those young women in your target audience that you wish you had had earlier in your career?
Get a mentor. Get a mentor as soon as you possibly can. There are studies. Did we need the studies? But okay, so there are studies now where the predominant female response is, if I had had a mentor, my career would have looked completely different. So you need someone who is not emotionally invested in you, but can see your career dispassionately and give you the support that you need. Secondly, believe that you deserve a mentor. You deserve to have somebody. You need your team. You need your tribe. Whoever they are, start building them now. Your friends are great. Your family is amazing, but they are completely biased in your favor, which is good. You need that. But you also need someone professionally who will give you guidance. So I think that's the biggest thing I would say to the younger upcoming generation. Forget about hierarchy. That's nothing to do with it. You need an auntie. You need someone who's going to be on your team, who can talk with you, talk you down off the ledge, and then ask you questions so you can be creative. It's not about the stealth artist saying, you ought to do this. You already know what you want to do. Everybody does. You just need the space, the safe container to allow yourself to let the noise stop so that you can think creatively. That's what your mentor will do for you.
I like that. And now, in your opinion, what are some steps that you think organizations and institutions can take, especially given your background in higher ed, but what can they take to create more inclusive and equitable environments for women of color?
Listen to them. Oh gosh. You have groups, you have these little groups that meet and they talk about things, and that it kind of gets moved one step up the food chain. And that's not enough. You have to have access to middle management who are to be held accountable for the fact that they need to take that further up the chain so that it gets to the highest level of policy change. We need policy change within company. That's what's going to, it's like anything else. You can protest and you can fill the streets and you can be very upset about what's going on and say, this is not going to happen anymore. But until you have policy change, nothing moves. And even with policy change, it's hard, right? Because we have the DFEH and we have the EEOC, but very often those are toothless instruments until you get into civil litigation, which we don't want to do. So companies can actually make their middle management a little bit more accountable. And in order to make that possible, they can compensate them for that. Instead of asking them to do it on a volunteer basis, so many people I come across in corporate, they are volunteering to take on DEI. How on earth are they going to do that on top of, for example, being a senior associate in a law firm? How do you think that person is going to do that? Unless they, you're going to show them the value. If you pay someone to do something, you're saying, I value you. That's what we use as currency, right? I value you, I value your time, and therefore this is going to happen. So listen to the women, make sure that the people who listen are accountable and that policy change happens across the board. And so that you keep on including people in the conversation so that, I think back to Hidden Figures, where the poor women had to go out, to a toilet that was a mile away or something like that. And it wasn't until they realized, nobody realized because it didn't affect them. That's the problem. If it doesn't affect you, you're not going to be responsive to it. So it's understanding that this may not affect you directly, but it will affect you indirectly because you will gain more retention. You will gain more employee retention. You'll stop the revolving door if people believe that they're being listened to, if people believe that they're valued for what they do. And if people are given equal opportunity for promotional advancement.
I like that. And now, what type of impact are you hoping to have in this next chapter of your professional life as this continues?
I want the Stealth Auntie network to be global so that any time in any of the time cycles, if there's somebody up at 2 a.m. in the morning, there's an auntie in Indonesia, there's an auntie in New Zealand, there's an auntie in Iceland who's ready to take that call.
And now what I love about season 3 is adding in a new type of format where I have a question that you can ask me. So what's one question you have for me that I could answer?
So I love this. We are seeing so much dissatisfaction from Gen X and millennials. And it's really, really concerning. They're not getting satisfaction from what they're doing. They feel like their values aren't aligned with the organizations they're working for. And so we're seeing a lot of resignation or planned resignation or career change. So you, as someone who is in touch with a lot of young people and a lot of feedback, what do you think the job landscape is going to look like for the upcoming generations in the next 5 years?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. One of the things, so I'm an elder millennial, right? So I think about all the things that we've been through economically, right? Financially, right? Whether it's, I'm a '09 law grad, so the '08 issues, the issues that happened around 2000, like all these things that we've experienced, and Gen X to some degree as well. And I think what I hear a lot of folks expressing is that now, like there was this dream of go to college, go to work, climb this ladder, whatever that means to you, and people are starting to realize, and maybe the pandemic even heightened it, that maybe that wasn't what I should have been doing. This whole debt issue, we're recording this now, but the whole student loan debt issue, I've heard of people who, getting the runaround on whether it's getting paid off or not. And there are folks in significant amount of student loan debt that truthfully they'll probably never pay off. Right. And so what the pandemic has really caused a lot of folks to do in my generation and Gen X has really caused us to step back. Like, wait a minute, what did we get ourselves into? And I think Gen Z is seeing that. And they're saying, you know what? I don't want that. I don't want that. Some of them might, but I don't want that. And I've also seen hey, I don't need to go to some organization and climb this proverbial ladder for whatever reason when I can make a livable, sometimes much more than livable wage in the creator economy, right? Whether that's being a freelancer, whether that's being a creator, and people may not agree with the types of creators that there are in this space, right? I won't go too deep into it, but there are people making pretty good money doing a whole host of things online. And so when you see that and people see that, and granted, it's probably oversaturated, right? But knowing that that's an actual viable option, I think people are starting to look at work differently. And one other piece I'll throw on there is that what the pandemic did, and what I've kind of noticed in my shows and some of the articles that I kind of read and digest, is that this whole option around where people work is a big thing. And if people can't work where they want to work, like remote, whether it be all of that, I think people are really starting to kind of push back on that, push back on some companies saying, hey, let's you have to come back. So over the next 5 years, I'm intrigued. I don't know what the landscape is going to look like. I'm curious to see how quits look over these next few years. At the time we're recording this, even though my show is about the Great Resignation and I have, a lot of guests still about that, technically this phenomena from a Bureau of Labor Statistics standpoint, it's kind of, quits are kind of slowing down, right? But what I wonder is if now folks are really, they're just taking the time to really plan out, to your point, really plan out what's next, the anticipated quits, because now folks are coming back into the office potentially. And there's this tension between management and sometimes frontline. And so how that plays out, I'm just grabbing my popcorn, to be honest. I really am. I really am. Cause it'll be interesting to see, but that's a great question. I thank you for asking that.
Yeah. I'm curious to see in this search for, basically it's quite philosophical. What's the meaning? Why am I doing this? What am I here for? And it kind of goes against the me generations, which we came up with, which was all about, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, get ahead. It's the, me first. It's the, you can do it. It's the individual achievement. And I think there's a real realization it's not about individual achievement.
Yeah. I can actually speak to that personally, right? And that, some of I'm in healthcare day to day. And if it was about the money for me, I wouldn't be where I'm at right now. Right? Like if it was truly about I need to, make X amount, my my LinkedIn inbox is not dry, right? And so it's not about that. But what I've found in this space is that, and I wrote an article about this a while ago called purpose driven work. And for me, it's about attaching myself to something bigger than myself. And even thinking about some of the initiatives that I get involved with now, which a lot of it is primarily around, education and youth and things like that, to see the impact that some of these programs have on young people's mind is really touching a place in me. I'm like, oh, why wouldn't I want to be a part of that? Right. And what initially started that was my role during COVID at a hospital, where I was co-leading an initiative with folks in the clinical space, administrative space, where, we worked on something where we were able to, redeploy some folks, give resources to an area, and those extra hands helped save lives. And that touched me and impacted me in a way I was like, oh, whoa. So that's when the healthcare thing really hit me. I knew I felt it, right? But I was, I've been in attorney in the HR space. I'm not day-to-day patient care. And I'll never be that. But to work on something that potentially saved somebody's life, I'll never meet those people. I'll never meet their families. But just to know that happened, that's when oh, wow, there's a bigger purpose that I could potentially serve with the work that I do, that I don't just need to be chasing dollar signs. I mean, money is good. Don't get me wrong.
It feels like we're moving into this, we talked a little bit about purpose just before we started this, but it feels very much like the perspective is changing so that you have less of a close-up of what I do to make money, that people are beginning to realize, oh no, it's much bigger than this. And that if I can do something that matters, then I have my life's purpose. So it's not about what the company what thinks that matters, what your organization thinks that matters, unless you happen to be with an organization like, I don't know, Médecins Sans Frontières, for example. But it's about how do I feel about doing that, making the choices that are within your, that align with your values, if we're going to use that phrase. But it's how can I be honest in this? How can I maintain integrity in this? How can I feel that I'm giving something of value back to the community? And these things that we haven't really considered for some time in terms of, career, right?
Right. No, absolutely. So I love that question. I appreciate, and thank you for asking that. Thank you for asking.
It was a great answer.
No, I appreciate that. Well, look, Sandra, this was a really, really good discussion. I'm so glad that we were able to connect online, and, you joining the show, I think, in the work that you're doing, clearly there's a need. 2, you're passionate about it. And there's everything, from a synergy standpoint, is all coming together. So I love to see that for you. And I just wish you all the best as you continue moving forward.
But thank you so much, Brian.
Absolutely. But we'd love for you to share, where can our listeners support you and find you?
Okay, so you can find me at www.wildwomenleadersofcolor.com. That's the website. Or you can just track me down on LinkedIn.
Great. So look, that'll do it for today's episode. Again, I want to thank my guest, Sandra Hunter, for joining me. I'll be sure to share her information in our show notes. And I hope you all have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again, Sandra.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks again for listening to Why I Left. Be sure to join us next time for more stories from the Great Resignation. Visit us at www.whyileft.co. That's whyileft.co. And subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.